So Antarctica, this icy continent at the bottom of the world, while we know it exists now, for a long time we didn't even know it existed. But despite that, the ancient Greeks insisted that a great southern land must exist in symmetry with the landmass in the north. They said without it, the entire world would topple over. And indeed, it was this idea of a great southern land that drove explorers to Antarctica to try to find it, to potentially exploit its riches. It was believed that this great southern land was more abundant with wildlife than the Americas. And if you look at this picture of what the great southern land looked like, you can see it's covered with rhinos and lions and even unicorns, which were thought to abound. But in 1770, this is what we knew of Antarctica. Almost nothing. It was this empty hole in our global maps with explorers setting out to try to find it. Among those explorers was Captain James Cook, who was sent by Great Britain to try to find that great southern land and its riches. While he never made it to the continent, he was the first to cross the Antarctic Circle. And as he tried to find the continent, he actually suggested that the world would not be benefited by discovering the continent, that future explorers seeking to discover Antarctica would have to confront what he said as an unexpressible, horrid aspect of the country, a country doomed by nature never once to feel the warmth of the sun rays, to lie ever buried under everlasting snow and ice. And he did not return to try to find it. But it didn't stop other explorers from going there. And in 1820, there are 3 different superpowers that claimed that they first discovered the continent. After discovering the continent came the famous quest to try to plant a flag at the South Pole, and the incredible story of Norwegian Roald Amundsen, who using skis and sled dogs was first to make it to the South Pole on December 14th, 1911. At the same time, an explorer from Great Britain, Robert Scott, was also trying to get to the South Pole. But when he got there, he learned that the Norwegians had beat him by over a month, which was devastating. Scott's entire team perished on the return home. And in fact, among Scott's last entries in his diary, he exclaims, "Great God, this is an awful place." But others still went. Among the most famous expeditions is Ernest Shackleton, who wanted to be the first to cross the entire Antarctic continent. And to do that, he put out this ad, "Men wanted for hazardous journey, small wages, bitter cold, long months of complete darkness, constant danger, safe return doubtful, but honor and recognition in case of success." And he did recruit a team to join him. As they entered the icy waters of the Weddell Sea, their ship became trapped in the ice. It drifted for 8 months and then became crushed to the extent that the men had to move to camp on the ice itself for another 6 months. And then when the ice broke up, they had to leave and try to find help. And in the most epic part of this journey, Ernest Shackleton had to take lifeboats that were only 6 meters in length and travel across the Drake Passage, the most treacherous stretch of the ocean in the world, and all the way to South Georgia, which was a 1,200-kilometer trip in these little lifeboats. He did find help in South Georgia. His team was rescued, but they spent 22 months on the ice. So the question is, why did we keep sending these poor explorers to this barren, desolate, and awful place? Well, it was because as these explorers were going there, they were planting their flags and staking claims for their home countries. And by 1942, 7 different countries had claimed parts of Antarctica, dividing it up like a pie, including overlapping claims in the peninsula region between Great Britain, Argentina, and Chile. I should also note at the time, the USSR and United States reserved their right to claim the whole thing. Now, tensions over claims were really intense at times, including throughout the 1940s and 50s, when Argentina was known to actually shoot at the British when they would try to land in the peninsula, trying to keep them from landing there, so literally fighting over their pieces of Antarctica. But the greatest military action that happened in Antarctica was in 1946, when the United States Army did what's called Operation High Jump. And they sent almost 5,000 troops to Antarctica, along with dozens of ships and airplanes. And the reasons were to set up bases in Antarctica, but they also had the motivation to train soldiers to fight in Arctic-like conditions in case war was waged in the high north in Russia. So you had the Cold War, you had the arms races, you also had the satellite races, where the USSR beat the United States by a long shot. But I want to highlight that in the midst of all of this, science provided unity in Antarctica. So all those expeditions I described had science and scientists on board, making discoveries, helping to shape national identities. Even on Shackleton's horrific expedition, even as the ship was being crushed, which was the men's last link to the world, the scientists were out there dragging their nets in the ice, sampling for fish and invertebrates. My point is that science has always been core to our Antarctic experience. And not just science, but international science collaboration. So in 1882, we had our first international polar year, where countries actually came together to collaborate to better understand the poles. The second one came in 1932. The third one came in the form of an international geophysical year in 1957-58. Again, this is at the height of the Cold War. And the international geophysical year had the problem of wanting to do international science in Antarctica amongst all those claims. And so to do this international year, this amazing thing happened where the organizers got countries to agree to set those claims aside for the sake of science. Countries agreed to share science and data, but to also share infrastructure, to share their bases, to share personnel, to share everything, to essentially suspend those claims for the sake of science. Now, this International Geophysical Year actually was set to correspond with this intense time of solar activity, and we built a base at the South Pole to measure that, and the scientists needed to launch atmospheric satellites or rockets in order to measure this solar activity. And now the technology at the time to launch satellites was linked to the technology to launch missiles. And so for many countries, they watched on in fear, thinking that we were going to be launching missiles from Antarctica now, that we would have the technology to do that, to potentially wage nuclear war from the bottom of the world here. And this quote from the New York Times really sums up the sentiment well in 1959. It is in our interest to ensure that this vast region should never be turned by the Russians into a kind of Antarctic Albania, where launching pads could be used by the USSR to blackmail the entire southern hemisphere from here. So a real crisis moment, but incredibly, based on that scientific collaboration of the International Geophysical Year, and in the midst of this crisis, instead of waging war in Antarctica, countries actually came together and signed a peace treaty. United States President Eisenhower invited all the countries that had been involved in that international year to Washington, and on December 1st, 1959, the Antarctic Treaty was signed, and it was immediately hailed as a breakthrough advancing the cause of world peace. So the treaty recognizes that it's in the interest of all mankind that Antarctica shall continue forever to be used for peaceful purposes and shall not become the scene or object of international discord. The Antarctic Treaty is actually our first post-World War II arms limitation agreement. It prohibits military actions. It prohibits nuclear activities. The Antarctic is actually one of our largest nuclear-free zones in the entire world. The treaty also took all those sovereignty claims and suspended them. It grants freedom of science. Later agreements banned mining and designated Antarctica as a natural reserve devoted to peace and science. So collectively, the Antarctic Treaty System is this suite of agreements that actually protects the waters and the land in Antarctica. And it is dedicated to peace and science and environmental protection. The treaty now has 58 signatories, and I want to highlight that all of these agreements are in place indefinitely. And really, I have to emphasize how the treaty system is one of our most marvelous achievements that humanity has done, where we took our differences and we set them aside for the sake of peace, for the sake of science, for the sake of the common good. We did this in Antarctica, which is truly amazing. And it means that Antarctica belongs to all of us and also is our collective responsibility. And there are new pressures in Antarctica that we need to worry about. Climate change is among the most stressing one right now, where Antarctic ecosystems are undergoing this tremendous change. Trying to summarize those, the air temperatures are warming, leading to increases in precipitation and wind. The waters are warming, which is then actually leading to decreases in the amount of ice in Antarctica, which is leading to sea level rise. This means it's a lot more difficult for life on land to continue, and increasing risk of invasive species in Antarctica. Now, the waters around Antarctica have marine life that is so superbly adapted to the freezing waters in the Southern Ocean, and life is beginning to decline in some places due to warming. And perhaps most troubling is that emperor penguins are actually at risk of extinction. We've never lost a species in Antarctica. We've never had a species go extinct. But due to declines in sea ice, emperor penguins are predicted to potentially go extinct. And so we have a lot of work to do to try to prevent this from happening. Now, beyond climate change, increasing tourism is happening in Antarctica, where we had 122,000 tourists go in the last season, and just as many predicted for this next season. Avian flu reached Antarctica in October 2023 and has since killed thousands of birds and mammals. And we have microplastics finding their way now into Antarctic snow, believe it or not. We also have increasing fishing interests. The Antarctic is one of these places that still has healthy populations of fish and krill, and so you have increasing interest to fish there. We also have fishing becoming increasingly concentrated in coastal areas, potentially competing with whales and penguins and seals. So what do we do amongst these compounding pressures? Well, we have this amazing tool called a protected area, which essentially just means setting an area aside, restricting human activities, and in those protected areas, as you can see in the graphic behind me, you have a greater abundance of life. You have a greater diversity of life, to the extent that actually protected areas can help be resilient to climate change impacts. And because of their effectiveness as a conservation tool, global governments are actually calling for a network of protected areas on land and the oceans, 30% of the world to be protected by 2030. Incredibly, parties to the Antarctic Treaty are actually working to mitigate these threats, including protected areas on land and protected species. We're also working towards a network of marine protected areas across the Southern Ocean. The two adopted protected areas are in gray on the map, and the hashed lines represent ones that are currently under negotiation. And I want to share that protected areas themselves can be an amazing tool for international diplomacy. In fact, the Ross Sea region protected area, it harbors one of the most intact marine ecosystems in the world, hence earning the name the last ocean. And getting this protected area adopted took international diplomacy at the highest level. We had to get every country that governs the Southern Ocean to agree to protect it, and that ended up taking presidents talking to each other to make that happen. And when it was adopted by all those countries, it was immediately this incredible source of pride. It's actually the world's largest marine protected area. You can see it on the map behind me. And then you can see the signatories, the signatures of all those countries that work to protect it there on the map. It was such a source of pride. And it was this incredible environmental win, but it also felt more than that. It felt like the signing of the treaty at the height of the Cold War, like a diplomatic win. And it showed that despite tensions in the world, that Antarctica continues to be this exceptional space dedicated to peace and science and the environment. Now our work in the Ross Sea continues. We're building what's called an international research coordination network, working across diplomatic and national boundaries to continue to study and safeguard the Ross Sea. And the Ross Sea is only one area that's important. I want to talk to you about the Antarctic Peninsula, which is another area being proposed for protection. And this is being led actually by Argentina and Chile together. And this area is incredibly important. It's home to the majority of Antarctic krill, which supports these huge populations of penguins and whales. And it's also the area most under stress, has the highest amount of tourism and fishing and environmental change, so really in need of protection. So here's the thing. I used to give talks about Antarctica, calling for protecting this place for the sake of the amazing wildlife that calls it home. And I used to tell this story of how I went to the Antarctic Peninsula in 2019 after not having gone there for 8 years. And I could scarcely find an Adelie penguin, which is actually my daughter's namesake. She wanted me to send her a picture of one, and I had trouble doing so because they had declined in the area due to warming. I used to make a call for protecting Antarctica for the sake of my children, including my son Orion Ross, named for the Ross Sea, so that they could have a future in which the Southern Ocean is thriving with life. And while I still think protecting Antarctica for the sake of its life is incredibly important, the reasons have become ever more visceral. So I'll never forget the day in the middle of 2020. I was on one of my favorite hikes with my kids, and the summer sun and the Rocky Mountains of Colorado were behind me, and suddenly the sky went dark. And I turned around to see this massive cloud of smoke blotting out the sun behind me, and immediately a cloud of ash was raining down upon us. And the smoke continued for 4 months straight, with conditions so toxic that we had to be locked indoors as the expansive forest of Colorado burned. The next year, more than 1,000 homes burned within kilometers of mine. It was another record fire, this time in the heart of winter. And now the fires continue with no end in sight. There's nowhere to go. And of course, the world is burning. It's warming dramatically. And I'm sure many of you have stories as well, if not of fires, then of other experiences you've had of extreme events. The fact is, the changes that we're seeing at home and across the world are directly tied to the changes happening in Antarctica. This is where we come back to the Greeks and that idea of a great southern land keeping the world in symmetry, keeping the world in balance. Because we now know that Antarctica, rightly placed at the center of the map, is critical to the functioning of the Earth system. It stores the majority of the world's fresh water and ice, which regulates our sea level. It actually drives global ocean circulation. And Antarctica regulates our climate. It's been storing an estimated half of all of anthropogenic carbon and heat, essentially buffering us from the impacts of climate change. So my point is that all of our actions will influence Antarctica, which will in turn influence our survival. So we need to do everything we can to protect Antarctica. And again, Chile is actually leading on this effort, which is amazing. But we also need to do everything we can to reduce greenhouse gas emissions in our homes and cities and countries, and we know what to do. We have the solutions for this. But in the midst of the climate crisis and ongoing global tensions, I want to remember that for more than 60 years, Antarctica has been a beacon of hope, this exceptional place of peace and science and environment. And we have another International Polar Year coming in 2032, so another opportunity to really collaborate internationally in this space. And finally, this great southern land critical to our survival, I want to ask that question: what humanity do we want to be? And I would answer one that does everything to protect Antarctica, because our future depends on it. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you.